Hey, hi there, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us for this next webinar in the Eurodad Policy Forum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today's session is entitled Building a Roadmap for Sovereign Debt Justice After COVID-19. So as the title suggests, we'll be focusing today on debt and crucially, whether and how the current crisis could be a catalyst for more fundamental reforms to the international financial system, and how we prevent and resolve debt crises, and how re-energized global debt justice movement can push forward long-term reforms on debt sustainability. We hope you're all safe and well, and you've been able to participate in some of the previous sessions this week. For those of you that haven't, we'll just go through some technical info on how the session will run today. I'm presuming during the lockdown, many of you have become familiar with Zoom and Zoom webinars, but we'll just run through a few things. During the session today, we're running until 3 o'clock sharp Brussels time, so 90 minutes. We'll start with longer interventions from our 4 expert panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. My name is Mark Pereira, and I'm part of the debt team here at Eurodad. Panelists and myself as a moderator will be speaking in English, but interpretation into Spanish is available via the function at the bottom of your screen. So you'll see a small globe at the bottom of the screen, and you can choose if you'd want to listen in English or in Spanish. You also have the option to mute the original sound if you wish, but that should be quieter when you're listening to one of the interpretation channels. Following the panelists' longer interventions, we'll have a series of question and answer rounds for you to engage more directly in the discussion. So please feel free to add in your questions to the question and answer function that you'll also see at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the chat function to share any additional information or comments. But I'd urge you to put specific questions in the Q&A box, as colleagues will be going through those to ensure that they're passed on to me and the speakers as they come in. So without further ado, let me introduce the 4 speakers that we have with us today and that have kindly given up some time today to be with us. They will be known to many of you, but just run down in alphabetical order. So firstly, we have Jaime Atienza. He's the Global Policy Lead at Oxfam on debt and is based in Madrid. He's held a number of key positions inside Oxfam and other CSOs and public institutions on economic justice issues, including migration, remittances, development finance, and debt. He is a development economist and a PhD candidate. He's lived and worked in Ecuador, in the United States, and in Spain. And many of you will also know him from his role leading the Jubilee campaign in Spain several years ago. Yuefeng Li is the newly appointed UN independent expert for foreign debt and human rights, who took up this new mandate in the middle of the pandemic outbreak this April. So fresh in the role, but a very experienced personality, as you will know. She's also the senior advisor on South-South Cooperation and Development Finance at the South Center, and prior to this had a long career at UNCTAD, including as head of UNCTAD's debt and development finance work and as senior economic affairs officer. She was also a driving force leading UNCTAD's work on promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing. Patricia Miranda is the Global Advocacy Director for Latindad, where she works on debt at the global and regional levels. She's part of the CSO Financing for Development Group, a member of the steering committee of the Civil 20, and chair of the Financial Transparency Coalition. Prior to joining Latindad, Patricia was a policy and advocacy officer at Fundación Jubileo Bolivia, the Latin American Regional Program Officer at Debt Relief International, and a public debt advisor to subnational governments. And last but by no means least, Liddy Nakpil, the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Liddy is also vice president of the Freedom from Debt Coalition in the Philippines, and a co-coordinator of the global campaign to demand climate justice. She's worked for many years on a number of issues, including economic, climate, tax, and gender justice issues. Also serves as a board member of 350.org and as a founding member of the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. So we really have an expert group of speakers here with us today, and judging by the participants I can see on Zoom, a very knowledgeable audience as well. So here's to a good discussion. As I said, please do share your questions and comments so that we can generate a really useful discussion here today. So just to frame the session, let me start with a very brief recap on the current situation, which will be broadly familiar to most of you. So concerns over rapidly rising debt levels and stocks across the global south were running high even before the outbreak of COVID-19, with the IMF signaling 34 low-income countries were in or at high risk of debt distress at the turn of the year, and voices such as Eurodad and many of our partners signaling the risks of development finance trends, increasing the vulnerability of developing countries to exogenous shocks out of their control. Sadly, these concerns were realized as the economic impacts of the crisis hit many developing countries early through a number of transmission channels. You'll know that there's been a collapse in commodity prices, sudden falls in export revenues, stops in remittances and tourism revenue, and record capital outflows amounting to around 100 billion US dollars by early April. So as financing conditions tightened, we've seen over 110 countries now having sought support from the IMF, an unprecedented number and in a very short space of time. Meanwhile, UNCTAD pointed to urgent debt relief needs of around 1 trillion US dollars for developing countries. So a fast-moving situation has driven international debt relief measures, principally from the G20, which would have been considered unthinkable only weeks ago. But when the offer amounts to around 14 billion US dollars breathing space for just the poorest countries in the world, are these ambitious enough to meet the scale of need? So far, we know of 36 countries that have taken up the G20's offer, while middle-income countries have received no relief whatsoever. And private creditors and multilaterals remain resistant to participation. And with emergency support being delivered mainly in the form of new loans, the prospect is that many countries will be even more indebted after the pandemic abates. So as liquidity crises rapidly evolve into sovereign insolvencies around the global south, a wave of defaults and austerity lie on the horizon. So in this session, some of the things that I hope we can look at today is whether we see a momentum in the response of the international community for much needed structural reforms to secure long-term debt sustainability in the global south and redress a system skewed in favor of creditors' interests. With estimates that the current crisis could push up to 100 million people into extreme poverty, erasing all gains made in poverty reduction in the past 3 years, how do we ensure a global response to unsustainable debts to secure the enjoyment of human rights, gender justice, and a pathway to the SDGs and Paris goals? An important part of this session will then be to look at also how we as a global civil society debt justice movement can strengthen partnerships and joint action to move this agenda forward with key actors such as governments and borrowing governments in particular. It's been significant to see the number of organizations that have joined collective work on debt or stepped up their individual work in the wake of the pandemic, adding vital expertise and capacity. As Richard Kozel-Wright from UNCTAD noted on Monday's first session of this policy forum, debt will be among the most important issues coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. As many of us have said, this will be a marathon, not a sprint, and it will be critical both to select collective priorities, build effective strategies, and maintain momentum and energy to put these into action. So that's enough from me. Let's now move to the people you really want to hear from. So I'll turn first to Jaime to kick off the discussion and would ask him kindly to respond to a couple of specific questions in his intervention. So firstly, it'd be great to hear from you, Jaime, on how you assess the global response so far to developing country indebtedness and the COVID-19 crisis. What's been positive in your view, and what is giving you cause for pessimism? And in addition, what is your genuine assessment of the likelihood of progressive changes to the system post the pandemic? Do you expect to return to business as usual, or will the pressures of several defaults and full-scale restructurings mean reform will be inevitable?
Well, hi everyone, and hello friends and colleagues out in the CSO system. And it's a great pleasure to be talking in this that forum I've been part of for a number of years. Thanks for the introduction, Mark, and thanks for those questions. I think when we try to have a balanced approach to what has been achieved and what hasn't, there are certainly some good things that we have to point at, and there are certainly a large number of things that still need to happen. So I will try to look at both. But first, I have to say, I think something that would frame the whole everything that I'm trying to express here, and it's that with what you have been pointing at, so growing poverty, threat of hunger, economic growth going down, jobs going down, public revenues falling between 30 and 40%, trade going down, commodity prices going down. So with all these items on the wrong side, let's say, what has arisen is that there is a massive need for finance. And while the richest countries and the richest economies can resource to the central bank, and we have the Fed, the European central banks, and our countries betting on how many trillions can be put on the table to do a response and at the lowest cost, this is not what's available for countries, for developing countries, and for most of the developing economies. So there's not going to be that much private finance. Private finance is getting more expensive, and we need more public finance, but it's not available. That's the key. So that's the reason why using the money that was reserved for debt payments for domestic response, both health response, nutrition response, but also economic preparation for the next stage are critical issues. So that said, that's when we arrive to the month of April, and we see some decisions being made. And I'm going for the positive first. And I have to say, I was surprised by the fact that we had a quick response. Those of us that have been around for a long time, we remember how things worked out in previous crises. And we remember, if we look at the hippie crisis, it took years to pull together an initiative, and it took more and more years to get some relief. During those years, people were getting even poorer, and their situation was being worse, and countries were under an economic crisis. And it took years for the first step. So I think this time we've had a quick understanding of the relevance of debt for countries and immediate action. This immediate action was triggered mainly at the G20 level with the debt suspension initiative that we'll talk a little bit about, and also by some decisions by the IMF especially, and then a lot of public speaking, and we can call it public relations or whatever, but the fact is that we had a lot of messaging from world leaders on debt. I think all those things came together, and within weeks of this crisis, we had some action. So that's the first good point. The second good point for me is that we have some cross-regional and cross-geopolitical action in this initiative. Of course, we could talk for hours and for days about the implications of having China, the Gulf states, other emerging lenders and funders alongside traditionals, and all the tension that was on the background, and all the implications of coming to this agreement. But definitely, it was an overall and a collective agreement, and that's something worth mentioning because we wouldn't dream of something like that before that was coming. There was also a significant amount of new funding, new financing coming out the door of some of the institutions, although that has, I think, positives and negatives depending on the conditions and depending on the use of that funding, which is something that we're not talking very much about. It's just about getting money out of the door and getting money in the house. And I think that's probably something we'll need to look at more in detail. I think a fourth positive factor is that we've heard Southern leadership, and we've been waiting for this for, I think, decades. And we listened to Imran Khan, we listened to Abiy Ahmed, we listened to Cyril Ramaphosa as the South African president, but also as the chair of the African Union, coming up with clear messages of what was needed for developing countries and speaking on behalf of themselves. And that's something we have been waiting to hear from for a long period. So this is also quite a significant positive step. And finally, I would like to mention that we have seen also efforts to build up larger debt responses. And I want to mention the UNECA proposal trying to build a bridge on how to go for a private debt solution and contribution. It's not happening. It's not being successful for the moment, and we don't know if it will be. I've been more optimistic some weeks back, and I'm less optimistic now, because in the moment where market conditions is a little bit, it's like private actors stop to be in a hurry to come to a deal and prefer just keep collecting the cash and wait and see what comes next. And that's a very bad situation for countries, I think. So all these are the positives, and Mark already gave us the facts on where countries stand and which are the countries affected. Let's go to the negatives. I think the negative is that there was a bad assessment of the initial problem. The problem with debt in developing countries is much larger than was assessed. So the response that was put on the table is much smaller than we would have expected. You can say there are good reasons for that, and I think they are reasonable. There are reasons we can understand, such as at the time of April, it was hard to assess how long this crisis and how deep this crisis would be. So some would think it was reasonable to be cautious in the approach. But as weeks and months pass by, we can only see that the prospects are getting worse. So action needs to be reverted. More countries need to be included, middle-income countries, and debt relief as was included there. That was just a debt suspension. So not paying 2020 and pushing those repayments into 2022, 23, and 24. We need now to shift this into something that's more profound. So that for me is a negative. A second negative is that G20 and IMF did a very nice call to private creditors to collaborate and to do so in comparable terms. I would have expected something much stronger, honestly. If someone is in charge in the world, you would say you have the highest ranked financial institutions, and you have the governments of the 20 largest economies sitting together, and they kind of kindly ask their private sector, because it's private actors in their own markets, regulated by their own laws and operating under their supervision, and they have to put their part, because it's urgent to save millions of lives and to protect humankind really, and millions of people everywhere. And they just come up with a bit of a PR exercise saying, please join. Well, I think that's not good enough, honestly. We should expect better, and we should expect a stronger language. I could read just 2 weeks back, in June 1st, a very interesting op-ed by Ngozi, the former finance minister of Nigeria, together with Gordon Brown and others, saying, we called for this voluntary approach. It's not working. We need to go for something stronger now. So I think it's now an assessment that it's not good enough to ask for a kind contribution. I think another thing that for me is a problem, and this has to do with both private and multilateral contributions to debt relief, is that the sense of urgency is not being taken seriously. So when we were thinking, and probably economists in this call and others familiar to how public finance work, the real urgent thing was avoiding money from being paid away of the country, because that's the cash that was available. And revenues were going to fall 30 to 40%, and all the external conditions were very bad. So this has not happened. Just a small part of those revenues have remained at home, but more and more countries, or a large number of countries, are still paying back all their debts to multilaterals and to privates. And I think there's a legitimate question about whether a suspension and a postponement of the payments is good enough, and you can discuss that from an economic point of view. We are pushing for debt cancellation for a period of 3 years, because we think that's what will bring the space countries need and allow them not to fall into economic depression. So that's how we see things, but we could understand that some say, okay, let's put a suspension only, but it should have been immediate and for everyone. It makes no sense that 2/3 or even 4/5 of debts are still being paid back. So I think this private and multilateral approach is what I would say. It's my last negative point on what we have seen at this point, Mark. And can I use two extra minutes, Mark, to look at immediate challenges and an honest assessment on where we see things going? Well, I think if we don't get a quick response and reaction by the G20 expanding this debt sustainability initiative, and we get actual binding conditions for private creditors, and also for a multilateral contribution that goes beyond throwing more money to countries. If we don't do this, we are going to face a chain of defaults in the coming 6 to 18 countries, and it's going to get really bad. We know that the system is not ready to deal with these many defaults, and it's not ready because we don't have a system to deal with this. And this is the main flaw of the debt, I think, of the international finance system when we look at debts. And this is something that needs to be dealt with. I look back in the days, there were a number of proposals, of creative proposals, of more, you can call them mainstream proposals. Even the IMF came up with their sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that was discarded 15 years ago. But I think we are going to need something that brings together all creditors, a system, a mechanism, so that we can resolve these crises that are upcoming. Of course, we need to do more on preventing, and I'm still hopeful that there can be more action, because I think numbers we cannot say that there's not enough red alerts being out there, so we need more action and more prevention to avoid the worst from happening. But we are going to need to go for such a system, because there's going to be an unmanageable, totally impossible to manage situation for those many actors. There are not even enough specialists, law specialists, to deal with these situations, enough people in the system to resolve this, and that's an immediate need, I would say. So yes, we are going to go for reform. I hope it can be done in an orderly manner, and while we put more on the prevention side, we try to fix and get a setting that will help countries out in the time of a severe crisis, which is still to come from many of these countries. And I would say more, Mark, but I think I'd rather leave it there so that we can keep listening to others and engage in dialogue later on.
Thanks very much, Jaime. It was a really useful and comprehensive overview of where we stand, and a valuable introduction to the discussion. I'd like now to move to Joachim, who we surely want to build on some of the comments and issues that Jaime's raised, but specifically given your the mandate that you have just taken up and at a particularly critical moment, it would be great to hear from you on a couple of specific elements. Firstly, we're hearing this phrase "building back better," which has emerged as a key buzz phrase in the past few weeks. But what does it actually mean? There's much talk of linking debt relief and emergency support to human rights, to the SDGs, and to the climate agenda. But how do you think that this can be done in a meaningful manner? As Jaime's has touched upon, when we see the G20 and the Bretton Woods institutions again in the driving seat for determining the global economic crisis response, whether or not we see some positive and negative elements to that, what realistic opportunities do you see for a UN-led multilateralism to rise to the challenges on debt that we're facing? So over to you, Joachim.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this debt session of the Eurodebt Policy Forum. Thanks, Mark, for the kind introduction. I'm supposed to respond to the two questions you raised just now. To save time, allow me just go straight to them. I've attended many virtual meetings on debt and FFD the phrase building back better buzzed almost in all the meetings. I think such a buzz shows clearly the dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, the current economic and development model, and also international governance. The pandemic is unprecedentedly global. To contain the spread of the virus, as mentioned just now, that lockdown and social distancing have been introduced. The knock-on effect has been severe and has led to deep economic contraction. And also the pandemic has exposed the weaknesses, social ills, and vulnerabilities in our economic and social systems. So, to us, the pandemic is like a magnifying glass exposing mercilessly the ugly side of the system, like inequalities, systemic racial and gender discrimination, the distortions in our economic and development model, and so on. So we could see that the health crisis has very quickly triggered a social economic crisis and a human rights crisis, actually. So at the international level, there is also a lot of inequality among countries, inequality between countries with reserve currencies and those which have not. These phenomena will manifest themselves more strongly when the economic recession bites. The problems in global governance have shown clearly. The pandemic has also shown that we have abused the environment. During the lockdown, people discover the beauty of environmental protection, the importance. They see blue sky, cleaner water in the river, and no traffic congestion. So this is the reason for the buzz for a better world on the economic side and the environment side, and also on the social economic system side. Then you ask, how is all this buzz linked with debt relief? Hami and you both mentioned that debt issue has dominated international meetings, and you mentioned also the reasons why that is the pre-existing debt problems before the pandemic. We all know that the pandemic, to contain that would require massive amount of financing, and there was the mention of 2.5 trillion US dollars, and even higher actually would be required. However, we know that because of the pandemic, almost all the revenue earning channels for developing countries have been closed. Mark mentioned just now, so I will not repeat them. And we also know that this debt problem is not only limited to low-income countries, the middle-income countries also, some of them are also suffering from unsustainable debt. And we also know with the evolving structure and composition of debt, debt servicing has becoming more and more expensive. Therefore, most developing countries have very limited physical space and buffer to deal with the pandemic. To save lives or to service debt becomes a human rights and also a moral issue. So in addition, we also know that without a very urgent supply of liquidity, there will be many defaults and the international debt market will be really chaotic. So against this backdrop, the IMF and the G20 had announced debt standstill just a few days apart last April. However, it is also very clear from their proposals that both IMF and G20 have been treating the debt problems facing developing countries as a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem, even though some countries have solvency problem. The efforts made so far are aimed at fast disbursement of emergency funds and very temporary debt standstill, no debt restructuring, no real debt cancellation, and the private sector involvement is very voluntary, as mentioned by Hami just now. So the current response from countries show clearly that the proposals are far from sufficient. Countries need liquidity, and Mark mentioned that more than 100 countries have applied for the IMF and World Bank emergency financing. And we know that they are interest-free and also have a grace period. But many countries have not accepted the debt service relief. Why is that so? Because the debt relief proposal does not cover bonds and have impact on the bonds. The coming 5 years, we know, will be the height of debt redemption for many developing country bonds, including low-income countries. Countries are afraid of reputation costs, meaning credit agency downgrading and all that, and they still rely on the access to international capital market to raise funds to roll over their debt. We know that in the first 2 months of the year, the capital market froze, but from April to May, there were quite a lot of sovereign bonds being floated. Actually, in May, it was twice as much as the same period before. And private sector involvement was already mentioned up to now is completely a failure, and no details whatsoever, no response. It shows that voluntary nature may not really apply. There are lots of other details. I don't have time to go into it. There was also the proposal of a fresh allocation of SDR. In April, the United States vetoed that. And so this, we still have to fight further on that. So from the responses, we can see very clearly the limitations of the current system. For debt relief and emergency funds, the IMF this time has a light conditionality. You just have to prove that the money is spent on pandemic fighting. For countries themselves, when they get this emergency funding and also debt relief money, they should think about how best to use it. They should pay attention to human rights issues in utilizing the fund and make sure that the vulnerable population would get at least a fair share, and desirably, they should receive the lion's share of the money. And also for stimulus packages, the vulnerable and also the green side should be considered. The international and regional financial institutions, governments, and private sector should carefully consider their own actions in light of their own human rights obligations as well as those of the debtors. They need to increase access to adequate health service, water, sanitation, and housing and social protection to fight the pandemic. This leads me to the second question. The current economic data has shown very clearly that a global economic recession is sinking in. For the first time for both developed and developing countries. And it's going to be in a kind of synchronized manner affecting all the countries at the same time. One thing different this time is that so far all countries have been relying on expansionary policies, fiscal and monetary stimulus, depending on the country's capacity, no austerity. As a result of these policies, debt, both public and private debt, has been exploding for both developed and developing countries. Very soon, I think we'll see more sovereign and corporate defaults. As mentioned just now, poverty will be increasing. and they're carrying the possibility of reversing the MDG and the SDG gains made so far. So the situation is pretty dire. However, we know that the crisis very often would lead to opportunities for change. This pandemic has exposed the problems of our current system, and now there is the pent-up desire to introduce systemic changes. Words like to have an inclusive, equitable, greener, and sustainable recovery have been voiced by the world leaders. This would be important for the civil society and the United Nations to join hands to influence this process of change and make sure the change will be pro-development and also take into considerations of the interests of the developing countries, and also will be a human rights approach. So on the debt front, we know the emphasis by the BWIs is still liquidity provision and very, very temporary debt standstill, which is too little and too short in duration. The United Nations has traditionally been more progressive on the debt front in reform. UNCTAD has advocated debt restructuring mechanisms since 1970s. And then it formulated the principles on responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, specifying the shared obligations of debtors and creditors. And also there was the principles on debt restructuring approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The Human Rights Council had the guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights, highlighting the obligations of different stakeholders. So it would be important to say that debt payment should not be be put in front of the state's responsibilities and priorities for human rights related expenses. United Nations, definitely we have been discussing and also planning to redouble efforts on formulating the debt restructuring mechanism, including a mechanism of automatic debt standstill. So here we hope the civil society will support and join in. And we have not forgotten that UN Security Council resolution in 2003 actually gave temporary shield to Iraq's assets from creditors. So we'll following and think about how it can be used. Very briefly, let me just mention very briefly what we would like to do in the short run from the UN and hopefully from your side, and also the civil society actually have been fighting along this all the time. Firstly, I think we should try to extend debt moratorium, the duration, which I have issued a press release. Secondly, we should request for more emergency funds from FIFIs and regional development banks, not only for LICs, but also for middle-income countries which have debt distress and having pandemic problems seriously. Thirdly, we should draw attention to human rights principles and UNCTAD principles to guide the use of debt relief and emergency funds. In the long term, I think we could fight for one, fresh allocation of SDRs and reform the IMF quota system. Two, improve the debt contract. Some people have already been doing so, and also revise the laws governing debt contracts. And then three, in the face of lack of an international debt restructuring mechanism, instruments helpful to cope with sudden and severe external shocks should be advocated. There are some instruments I will mention when we have time. And also we should try to operationalize the human rights and UNCTAD principles on debt. I would have more other points, but I don't see I would have time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Griffin. There's a lot in there, so hopefully we'll have time later in the Q&A and the open discussion to pick up on many of those really valuable points. The You touched in the very last part on some of the need for increasing support to middle-income countries as well, which brings us nicely to what I'd like to pose to our third speaker, Patricia Miranda. So much of the focus of urgent crisis responses, as Jochen and Jaime have pointed to, has rightly been given to supporting the poorest countries. But as we know, income level is not the only indicator of vulnerability in this crisis. So how do you assess the support that has been provided or not to middle-income countries, and indeed what more needs to be done to support all countries? Jochen has touched on the issue of special drawing rights. You may wish to expand on that. And secondly, while we are still in the midst of an urgent social and economic crisis, particularly when we see the evolution of the pandemic in the Latin American region, looking long term, where do you see the key pressure points for joint civil society action? So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. And indeed, it's what has been already mentioned as well. It's important that there has been a quick response for low-income countries. But even for low-income countries, we think that the current approach is far from being enough. And this lack of ambition on the crisis response is even more evident if we talk about middle-income countries. Under a classification that has lower middle-income countries as well. In the case of Latin America, all countries except Haiti are middle-income countries. But this classification criteria is based on GDP per capita, which has been criticized for ages from our side and from different stakeholders. Because as every average ratio, it hides the reality of life conditions of each country. So you were asking me as well, mentioning a new landscape, and the debt in Latin American countries have an increasing trend under a new landscape with not only the traditional external debt that we had in our former crisis decades ago, but we also have a huge domestic debt. We have issued sovereign bonds in the last decade. Even former hippie countries now issue sovereign bonds. And we have new fiscal risks such as state-owned enterprises debt, subnational debt, and contingent liabilities. And we can mention the risks of public-private partnerships here. So some countries in our region were close to debt distress, or some already in technical default. But in general, all our countries had a fiscal deficit for at least the last 2 years before COVID, and some of them for more years. So we were already in problems before COVID. In addition, the decrease of oil prices since 2014 and the lack of actual possibilities for domestic resource mobilization for our countries, debt has been the source of finance, with a few concessional loans because we are middle-income countries. So while we are severely hit by the pandemic under a multiple crisis, the main solution that our countries are offered by the financial global community is to help us to get more indebted, with few concessional loans available and the access to new IMF programs. And this is as well from other multilateral development banks and from regional banks. So for decades, we have been prioritizing the financing of infrastructure, but not social infrastructure, the privatization of health service, and a high dependence on commodities with a really little or non-change in our current productive matrix, which led us to a precarious health system to react effectively to this crisis in a context of high informal sectors, high inequalities. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, and a high human toll, where women and girls are particularly hit. So COVID-19 is not the only or single crisis. It's reflecting and accelerating a crisis, a multiple crisis that civil society organizations were alerting at different levels for the last years. So as I've been saying, the solutions offered and available for middle-income countries to face these multiple crises are not a real help. They are just a postponement of our current problems, bringing more debt burden to be repaid in the next years, and we really don't know if we will be able to pay that in the next years, pushing our countries to decide whether to pay that new debt service in the next years or cut social investments. So we are in the same wheel, with no structural changes to deal with the impacts in the long term, because these decisions will have an impact in the middle and long term. Where in addition, rollovers in this context are not an option for many countries. So recovery will take longer for our countries if we compare with developed countries. And taking your question, but also what has been mentioned by my two colleagues, first, I think there are many challenges that we can face from our Latin American civil society organizations. I will mention some of them that has been already put on the table. So we need ambitious measures now. We need desperately liquidity and new resources. Middle-income countries and low-income countries and lower middle-income countries also need an external debt service cancellation, not only suspension. And well, besides what have been mentioned, the challenge as well is the private debt. We don't know who they are, who owns these bonds, who do we have to negotiate with. And this, it would be ideal to have a global initiative, not a case-by-case negotiation by each of our countries that increases the risks. And also the other challenge here is that the private sector, the private creditors seem that they are not willing to be part of the solution, because they might not be able or willing to lose 1 cent when the way out of this crisis needs to have the contributions of all sectors, not just a toll to the poorest. So in the short term, we need liquidity to face the pandemic and the multiple crises. We need non-reimbursable financing, and of course, without conditionalities that we know by far. So that is one point. A second point is also, from our view, it's also for a short term, because we need fresh resources now. This debt service cancellation for 2020 and ideally 2021 will let us breathe, but it will not be enough. So we need fresh resources, more fresh resources to face the pandemic and this without this recession without precedents. So the second thing that we can push more from civil society organizations is the special SDRs issuance that has been mentioned already. But considering that this has a quota allocation criteria, civil society should push for a reallocation where developed countries give up to these rights and to transfer them to developing countries. This would mean to have access to resources that can be used as budget support to fight the crisis, with no need to repay capital, and with a very low cost. It's like 5 basis points. And it's important also for civil society organizations to understand that this is not an IMF program, that therefore it doesn't have conditionalities. It's actually an international political agreement, and there is a challenge. So it's not an IMF decision. It's IMF would be the operator, but the decision would be made by the members from the IMF, by all countries, as with an international political agreement, and it needs a political will, where I think CSOs and movements need to advocate for. A third point would be for us to change the debt sustainability concept that has been managed for many years, which is basically a country is sustainable if this country can repay its debt without having to renegotiate it. And from what we see and what we live, debt sustainability should be, a debt should be sustainable if the repayment of this debt is not affecting social investment, or at least social protection floors in our countries. So that criteria for the current new debt wave that we are going through is important for all creditors, and also to be taken into account from our countries when we have a new loan. For as borrower countries, it's important to still push for a citizenship surveillance on the use of debt, on transparency issues, and to push for to have a financing strategy from our countries that actually matches developing goals, aim to reduce inequalities. So from at the national levels, we need to push more for civil society participation on the decision of where a debt and a loan will be allocated and how, and the impacts of that loan. And then a fifth point is more aimed to long-term measures, because as I was saying, the debt monster was there before COVID, and these short measures will not solve this entire problem. So we need to have in place a debt restructuring process. It has been fairly mentioned before by Jufin and Jaime. We have our current challenge now with Argentina in Latin America. It's unfortunately for many years our emblematic case, and to have a process after their default is not the best. We need a timely fair process now before a country gets in default. So this is a very important process that is going through the current crisis. And a final point is to mention in these long-term measures why we are indebted. We get debt because we don't have enough resources to achieve our own development goals. So it's important also to link that with a global will to allow developing countries to actually mobilize domestic resources. That which led us, our economies, to have sustainability, fiscal sustainability, and therefore social sustainability, to finance our development goals, to finance our national development plans. And it's important to make this linkage and to push for this in the long term, because otherwise debt will still be the main source of finance and the main solution, sadly, for our countries, as it is now under the worst crisis that we are going through. So I will stop here and move on with Q&A for further information. Thank you.
Many thanks, Patricia, and indeed we have a lot of activity on the Q&A, so we will come to several of those questions hopefully after Liddy's intervention, but you'll see that some questions have already kindly been answered by Jaime and other speakers. Just to let you know that Liddy may be having some problems with her internet, so she may switch off her video during her intervention if you suddenly see her disappear from your screens. That's why. So moving on swiftly to her, I will pose two questions and then invite her to respond. So we've heard a number of different issues, including from Jaime on how there have been, interestingly in this crisis, we've seen a lot of vocal calls and proposals put on the table by borrowing countries and Southern-led initiatives. So it would be interesting to hear from you, Lydia, on how you see the prospects for a coordinated borrowing country approach to global reforms. But with national governments fearful of the reaction of financial markets, as some attendees have pointed to in the Q&A box, and the way we've seen little public support for initiatives such as that of Pakistan to mobilize countries at the UN on debt issues, can we really expect unified borrowing country positions to be driven forward? And how can we as a global civil society movement do more to support national level reform initiatives? So a lot there, but over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and throughout this webinar, I've already lost connection twice. So rather than pull on my bandwidth, I'd like to just request everyone's permission for me to just stop my video so I don't get dropped off while I'm speaking. So thank you. Well, before I answer your question, I just like to make three quick points that I think is very important to put the debt problem in the proper context and in the perspective of how we see it as people from the South. Well, first of all, just to respond to this question about the debt crisis, we have long been saying that we need to point out that the current dominant understanding or framework on a crisis, a debt crisis, is really very much from lender or creditor point of view. A debt crisis is defined as a situation when the borrowing governments and the borrowing countries are unable to pay or unable to pay fully and on time. And that means it's a crisis from the point of view of the creditors because they don't get their money or they don't get it fully and on time. But our experience in the South is that we have been actually in continuing debt crisis. If we were to define crisis in terms of the impacts of the debt problem and indebtedness to peoples and communities in our countries, we have long been suffering from the impacts of our resources going, a lot of it going to debt payments, and a lot of the projects actually being financed by borrowing are projects that actually haven't benefited our people. So just to point that out, that one of the great challenges that we have in this fight for debt justice and debt sustainability is to fight this discourse fight, to point that out, that crisis should not just be defined in terms of the perspectives of creditors and lenders. The second point I'd like to make is the question of debt sustainability. I really think we either should go beyond simply raising sustainability or redefine sustainability so that we put justice also squarely at the center of the framework of sustainability. So the debt problem is not just about our capacity to pay the countries that have borrowed. It's not just about our capacity to pay without compromising or undermining the ability of our governments and countries to deliver on their duties and obligations to provide essential services, to be able to address inequality and poverty in our countries. It's also a question of why are we being made to pay debts that have been, yes, incurred in our name because these are public debts, sovereign debts, but actually much of it is not going to purposes which have our interest at heart or at interest as a primacy. Many stories have been told about many, what we call supply-driven lending or supply-driven debt, when the interest of lending has been primarily on the part of the lenders pushing for, purchase of products or services or projects that have involved their economies and their trade interests. It's not just a question, yes, there's a problem of corruption in our governments in the South, but it is not just a question of our governments. No, one of the biggest issues we've raised in the last decade and a half, and this has come from our colleagues also in Europe, is the notion of co-responsibility of creditors for the huge debt problem, and that needs to be brought back in the discourse and in the pursuit of solutions for the debt. The third point I'd like to make is that yes, I agree very much with Patricia. The problem is that our governments are saying they are compelled to borrow because we don't have enough resources for many of the things that we need. But putting it in a broader perspective, there is a net flow of resources from the south to the north. It is not that we are not able to create wealth in our countries. It is such that relations and structures do not allow us to keep that wealth in our country. So even when we talk about trade, when we talk about profit repatriation, payment of interest on loans, and so on. So it has been a long history of more financial and other resources flowing from our countries to the north, rather than what the northern creditors and institutions talk about is capitalizing the south. No? So actually, we have been being decapitalized rather than being capitalized. And that also includes, of course, problems of tax evasion and tax avoidance by multinational corporations. Now, just to go to address your question, sorry. I think one of the issues that one of the needs or challenges that we need to face here in order to bring about a stronger political will on the part of borrowing governments, and especially bring about more coordinated actions among borrowing governments, is that we need to have stronger civil society voices and movements in the South that is raising the debt issue. We know the problem with Southern governments. They will not take up issues that they perceive to be in their short-term, not in their short-term interests, especially since you know, many of the paradigms, development paradigms that they have are actually shared with the questionable paradigms that is being peddled by international institutions. And they're not going to do this, even if it's clearly in the interest of our people, unless they are compelled to do so. You have mentioned one of the problems, no? If they are in this borrowing cycle, they will not do anything to what they perceive to risk their capacity to borrow from the financial markets. And it has led to a point where their governments have actually refused debt relief because they are afraid that that will be putting their government and the country in a situation where it will be seen to be in distress, and therefore it cannot borrow from the financial market. So these are the challenges, and we need to rebuild those movements in the South to compel our governments to have, you know, stronger spines, at least to do the right thing in the short term, even though we know that some of the more strategic changes that have to be made in our economies in order to avoid reaccumulation of debt is something probably that's going to be beyond the possible given the current governments that we have. So I think it's very much a political question. We need rigorous policy critique and alternatives, but that is not enough. We need the political force to be able to push this through, because if we can win on the strength of really more superior arguments, we should have won a long time ago. So we need that political will, and we need to build that through rebuilding the debt movements and debt work and debt campaigning in the South. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liddy. Okay, so we've had some really strong and powerful interventions and a lot of information to digest there. Unsurprisingly, the questions coming in are spanning a number of different issues. So given that we have about 20 minutes left, I regret that we probably won't be able to go through all of the questions, but let's do our best. So we'll try to start. Let me start in the order that that things have come in and merge a little bit. So we had a first set of questions on private creditors. So I'll pose this to the panelists. Perhaps Jaime could come in first, and then others that may wish to jump in. I will ask you to keep your interventions a little bit brief so we can try and go through as many of the questions as possible. So Isabel from ActionAid is asking what would efforts to compel private creditors to participate in debt relief, what would that actually look like? Do we need national laws from current countries of origin of those private creditors? I think also we know we need to look at key jurisdictions on where debt is contracted. She also asks, who are those private creditors? And interestingly, what happens if countries don't pay back or default? They won't have liquidity anymore, or are there good things in such a scenario? So we'll start there. Over to you, Jaime.
Thanks, Mark. I think when we look at the private finance and the private debt field, I think there's one thing that's not on the table these days, and it's that financial losses are unavoidable. So they are going to come and they're going to hit the accounts of countries. They are already doing, and that's what should be expected from those that have invested in those countries. So when we look at the approach of pretending that there will be no impact on the net present value of payment obligations by developing countries to private creditors, it's a denial of what is coming. And what is coming is that no one is going to collect the money that they had lent, in summary. So it's not an easy road to mention. I'm going to try and answer a little bit on this one. And I saw some other questions on this same field by Christina from Jubilee, Germany, and Matthew Martin, that's the Director of Development Finance International, that are related. What we are seeing first is that private actors were initially willing to be part of a concerted action. You could say there was a general feeling that these losses were coming soon and that a chain of defaults was going to go against the interest of all actors. So they would be willing to take on a negotiation, but this seems to have been cooling down. And what Matthew was mentioning in his own message is that the approach that was promoted by UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, was the right one, and I do agree with this. It was leaving a 5 years grace period where no payments would be made, and kind of transforming current bonds and current loans into a new vehicle that would be paid in longer term conditions to be negotiated. This would require some public support. What we know is that this proposal, there was also a private group of creditors, the Africa Private Creditors Group, self-selected large investment funds, large investment banks that were willing to engage in such a dialogue, but we don't have results of this. And what we don't know yet is if there are countries or public institutions that would like to support some kind of arrangements that would kind of support this kind of approach. The latest reports from Bloomberg in the news is that there are a number of large countries that would support such a scheme to try to help countries out of at least the 2020 period. But we don't have very good information because this is not public. This is sparring off. This is all happening behind the scenes. So it's difficult to say. What we can say is that there is an immediate impact for countries that decide to default on their payments. So it's not something we can just think about. But I shared a note on Cameroon's being reviewed for a downgrade after accepting the debt suspension offered by the G20. This was an official Moody's note. So credit rating agencies are downgrading countries that decide to go for this operation because the rationale is that if they are saying they need debt suspension or any kind of debt relief, then their debt position is weaker. So we're going to downgrade it. And that means countries will get less finance in the future and more expensive. There is, of course, a trade-off there. So what we've seen in the past in other countries is that countries that fall off the market for a while then get back in the market, because the market has a very short-term memory, and that's something that needs to be factored in. But in the immediate, countries are fearing to be pushed away and not getting new finance. Is there some good in that? Well, if we had some, I think it was Lydia that was speaking to the need of concerted action between developing countries. So if you had a significant group of countries saying, you see, we are not going to pay back now, and this is the rationale, we are being hit by a crisis, we don't think we need to pay back now, we are going to take care of our people and of our economy, and we hope to be back in 2 years' time, and we want to negotiate on these grounds. Well, this would be a very rational approach and could be an opening for transformational changes, as you were asking for, Mark. But I'm not seeing that kind of environment yet, although for the first time, as I was mentioning in my introduction, we've seen a number of southern governments speaking out and saying we cannot be pushed into keep up with our payments when our economy is falling down. In fact, I honestly, as an economist, I can't really understand that there is this pressure to keep the net present value of all the loans and the bonds exposed when all the economic sectors are falling apart, and you see the impact on jobs, on revenues, and on the economy is so massive. So really moving in that direction is something we could be seeing. I've tried to touch on Christina's, Matthew's, and this other colleague from Action Aid's comments. I'll leave it there, Mark, so that others can chip in, of course.
Great, thanks very much, Jaime. I don't know if other panelists want to touch on the various questions on private creditors. Yufin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think right now there have been various proposals. The latest from IIF is that the private sector expressed their willingness to join the initiative, but they would like to do it case by case. And we know that will be quite complicated. Of course, there's also the proposal hoping that the IMF or EU or some governments will provide guarantees to some of the private loans or some of the private debt. But I don't know whether, for instance, the IMF would consider this, or other governments or institutions would consider this. And there are also other proposals similar to the African Economic Council, how would you say that? UNECA. That is, it is more or less a kind of debt reprofiling approach. That is, the debt will be on a kind of standstill, and then they would evaluate whether the country would have the ability to pay. And if they would like to have a debt restructuring, there will be a separate fund or whatever. But the operation of this kind of arrangements is also quite complicated. And the ongoing efforts also include such things like improvement of bond contracts, which takes longer to put into effect, but would also be useful and helpful. Of course, there is also initiatives like introducing national laws, like the Belgium law on vulture funds, which would prohibit the holdout on the debt restructuring. But not too many, it's very encouraging, but not too many countries have followed this. So, which means now there are various kinds of proposals, but it doesn't mean that the debt restructuring will be easier, because with improvement of contracts, bond contracts, the big financial institutions also found out ways to try to circumvent these rules. For instance, the current Argentina debt restructuring, which shows very clearly that you have larger financial institutions not specialized in buying this kind of distressed bonds. They are traditional financial institutions, but they have purchased much larger shares of bonds, which they have a say, dominating say. And then they tend to be very persistent about their position, and they don't know what to do. So there is the kind of improvement contracts, and then also the private creditors trying to find out ways to avoid or circumvent the improvements. So we are facing a lot of challenges on this front. Thank you.
Thanks, Yufin. Patricia, you wanted to jump in. I may also just point out that there was some additional questions that you maybe want to touch on some of the risks of SDRs. I'll point out that we will have a specific webinar on that next week, so we'll share information on that with you very soon. There's also a question about what sorts of instruments developing countries might use in contrast to richer countries that maybe allowed very large debt levels, such as Japan. But feel free to address any of the questions that have come in.
Thanks, Mark. I was actually trying to jump in because of the private issues. I want to briefly mention on a question from Matthew Martin on PPPs that caught my attention. And yes, indeed, I have not seen on the table a proposal regarding the contingent liabilities and all the debt that comes from public-private partnerships. And this is, I think, as well part of the challenge on what can we achieve with the private debt. And also from what we see in our countries, it's important to make a difference between PPP's initiatives with multinational. That's the main ask and demand that we have from CSOs, but also to have to make a difference with the smaller initiatives, with PPPs, with at subnational levels, with local companies, local enterprises. So I think it's important to make that difference. But yes, it should be also part of the solution to the current crisis. And another challenge I see there is that there's not enough information of how much are we talking about. Usually the value for money methodologies to assess the debt that comes from PPPs is still scarce, and there's still not enough information or projected information for the next years to know about the burden on the debt service and the burden on budgets. So that is a very, I think that's more than a question, more than answering this. I think that this is a good point to put in the spot. Regarding other questions that have been raised on the risks of SDRs, we have been analyzing pros and cons, and the current if we can say proposals put on the table is to use the current SDR allocation to deliver, to reallocate to low-income countries only, because we're not talking about a huge amount of money if we speak of the current allocation that is available now. But on the other hand, we have also a more ambitious proposal in terms of the size. That there are many calculations, but it should be at least 1 trillion. And also in terms of who are the beneficiaries of that, and that is very linked with the other question on the capacity of developed countries. And developed countries have a reserves capacity to issue SDRs and transfer them to developed countries, a capacity that our countries don't have. and therefore we cannot, middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries cannot afford to issue their own money because the economic risks are higher for us. So I think that's a linked question. I am linking this in my answer, that because of we don't have the fiscal space, we don't have the capacity in our reserves, we need this from developed countries who do have the capacity. And you mentioned Japan with such a higher debt ratio, because they have a capacity in their central banks, and also in their economics, in their fiscal space to do this. And the other thing is that the SDRs are sometimes called a gold paper, because it's money created through a political decision, a political will. And it's after this analysis that we are making, we find more pros than cons. And if it's a transfer of resources, not as debt, it's just a transfer of resources for the central banks of our countries, I think risks are really few, or perhaps none, because we don't need to repay that debt. It's not a debt, it's not a capital to be repaid. And I think it's important to dig deeper into this. So as Mark said, and I'm going to do a little advertisement, as Mark was mentioning, we are organizing a special webinar on special drawing rights next week on June 25th. And along with Eurodad and other allies organizations, we would like to address there, well, let's dig more into that. What are special drawing rights? How do they work? How they can really be a benefit for our countries? How can then be used? But what would be our civil society organizations' strategy and response to the current proposals from the IMF and from other institutions in the global financial community? So I think that would be my answer so far, Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Patricia. As you'll all have noticed, we have just a few minutes left. Apologies for that. I think there's a very, very huge number of issues that we want to cover. So I'll hand over to Liddy to respond to a couple of questions, and then we will have to cut off immediately at 2:59 because there's another webinar starting at 3. So I'll just, in case I run out of time very unprofessionally, I will just flag that in addition to the webinars that on SDRs that Patricia mentioned, we are hoping to run one on private creditors in a couple of weeks and a couple on debt sustainability as well. So there will be ample time to pick up on a number of these issues. So consider this halfway in the discussion, by no means the end of it. So Liddy, over to you. I know we have a question on linking climate justice to debt restructuring, but also on debt cancellation and illegitimacy of loans.
Yeah, well, there are upsides to being last, but this is the downside. I have 2 minutes. Thank you,
Exactly.
Elaine, for asking that question about demanding no more loans, as well as demanding for debt cancellation, because that is certainly one of the demands that we have been raising, not just us as a regional formation, but many organizations and movements in various countries. We cannot take in any more new loans, even if they're saying it's for COVID-19. We think it's really just so outrageous that so many financial institutions and governments have been extending loans, and our governments have been accepting them. So it's just going to put us into hotter water if we're going to increase our level of indebtedness because of COVID-19. So this is really a very outrageous situation, and it is indeed one of the demands that many groups have come together on and have been raising. The second point, which is what Shetel is raising about the illegitimate debt, I think this is really a very good time to regain momentum on raising the question of illegitimate debts. We know that all of us have come together for demanding the cancellation of debt payments, at least for the next 1 to 2 years, if not for longer. And we really need to use this period to be able to raise this question of not just the amount of loans that we are paying for, but what are these loans that we have been paying for many years. So I think this is really the right time to revive the call for the debt audits, because the breathing space that we are seeking for the cancellation of payments in the next 2 to 3 years is not just financial, but it's also a breathing space so that we can begin to tackle again the question of debt as simply more than just capacity to pay and the funds that are being wasted on debt payments instead of being spent on the things that the country needs most. So we need to use this opportunity to push this again, debt audits, and to revive this whole discussion about illegitimate debts, because it is not just, again, sustainability, but also the legitimacy of these debts that we have been paying for. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity to share our thoughts with you. Thank you.
And thank you so much to all the panelists and to all of you attendees for the great questions. Apologies that we couldn't cover everything, but we have 4 very, very experienced and knowledgeable speakers here, so I hope you've been able to benefit from the wealth of information that they've shared. As mentioned, we have a number of webinars coming up, so we'll hope to pick up a lot of the discussion in those on SDRs, on private creditors, and on debt sustainability. And we will save your questions to try and infuse those discussions at those webinars. Thank you all to everyone. Apologies for the very abrupt end, but we have another webinar starting at 3, so I've been told very strictly that I need to cut off. So thanks very much, and best of luck to everyone with the ongoing work. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.